You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with Novara Media's contributing editor, Moya Lothian-McLean, and Conservative Home's deputy editor, Henry Hill. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on the front pages for you now. Well, The Times has said that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has been told by Boris Johnson and David Cameron to drop plans to scale back HS2. According to The Express, a group of right-wing MPs has told Rishi Sunak that the Conservatives can only win the next election if they return to the party's traditional values. The Daily Telegraph reports on a so-called woke takeover of Whitehall. That's from a letter sent to the Cabinet Secretary. The Financial Times hears the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt is planning a revamp to individual savings accounts, or ISAs. A smoking ban for future generations, that's in The Guardian. Elsewhere, the Daily Mail reports on a 19-year-old woman who has her life support machine switched off after a legal battle with the NHS. Sudishka Thirumerashen can be finally named after the judge lifted a legal order. A royal story on the front of The Sun, where it says Prince Harry has snubbed the King's offer for him to stay at Balmoral as the family marks the Queen's death anniversary. The Star, on the other hand, criticises the King for taking a private jet home from France shortly after giving a speech on what he called the existential threat of global warming. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Moya Lothian-McLean and Henry Hill. Welcome to you both. Let us start with the front page of The Guardian and this story about potentially the next generation not being able to smoke, not having access to cigarettes. This is a plan that reportedly Rishi Sunak is looking to copy. New Zealand have been the first to pilot this idea. Moya?
Yeah, so this comes after the proposed vape ban as well, and it's Rishi Sunak's latest attempt to distract from the myriad other bits of turmoil that's going on in his government with some sort of draconian policy. And according to this, what they'll do is they will raise the legal age by which it's possible to buy cigarettes. So eventually people who were born after 2009 will not be able to legally purchase cigarettes. Will this happen? I don't think so, because I don't think Rishi Sunak's government has enough time left in the tank to enact something like this. But it's interesting, and I'm sure we'll get into this, to understand exactly why they may be throwing out policy like this at this point in time.
So this New Zealand-style policy would mean smoking being phased out completely for the next generation. So those aged 13 and under would never be able to buy cigarettes. Unworkable?
I mean, the emphasis should be would never be able to buy cigarettes legally. We have banned all kinds of things, and young people manage somehow to get their hands on them. It's already a problem, actually, for tobacco regulation, that because of how heavily regulated tobacco is, cheap black market tobacco is much cheaper, and there is a growing problem with black market tobacco, which is unregulated, which often funds violent crime and organised crime. And what this is going to do is effectively create another potential black market for those groups to move into. Again, I agree that I don't think this is going to happen. I don't think Rishi Sunak can bring this policy in time. But if he does, it sits very uncomfortably with talk in other circles about, you know, reducing the voting age to 16 and everything else. I think we need to decide if someone at 18 is a legal adult, that should mean that they can make the same decisions that we as legal adults can make, even if those decisions are sometimes contrary to their health.
Do you agree with Moya, though, that this is perhaps a diversion tactic being deployed by Rishi Sunak?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, this is not going to happen. With a government has at most a year and a bit left until the general election. The Conservative Party hates this kind of policy, generally. The British public will love it, right? Because, one, they love banning things in general, and they especially love banning things for other people, which is mostly what this will be. So it would be a very popular policy. But the idea that he will get this drawn up, drafted by the Department of Health, past his own MPs and into law by the next election is for the birds.
OK, so a big cross on that one. It's never going to happen, according to these two. Let's move on to the Times. Now, is this going to happen? HS2, much speculation as to whether the entire plug should be pulled on the whole the whole scheme, Moya?
There's been 2 interventions made after the noises that have been coming out this week from the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak that HS2's long-delayed Manchester phase is now potentially not going to happen full stop. The reason they've given is we've gone way over the infrastructure costs that were initially projected, which I think Henry's going to analyse for us in a second. But there's now been this intervention, as I said, made by Boris Johnson and David Cameron, 2 previous prime ministers. Of course, it was Cameron who brought this in the first place, saying it's ludicrous to drop this idea. It's ludicrous to drop this £1 billion project, which is much needed for the North in terms of the levelling up agenda the Tories have been so pushing until the very last moment. And to do it would completely undermine the promises they've been making over the last 10 plus years, decade and a half. So HS2 is once again at the centre of massive political turmoil within the Tory party. And I can't understand why they want to drop it, because it is delivering on all the agendas they claim to, apart from the spending.
It's the money. It's Treasury. This is pure Treasury thinking, right? Instead of trying to tackle the reason that this is so expensive, which is, and this happens to all British infrastructure. There are deep structural problems. Everything we try and build ends up late and wildly over budget. But instead of tackling that, they're chopping bits off. And it's mad because it kills the case for the bit that we've already built. The whole point of HS2 is not really about speed. It's about the fact that the West Coast Main Line, which is one of this country's biggest rail networks, is full. And if you had a passenger express line, that means you could have way more commuter trains into Birmingham, Manchester and London on the regular line. And if we don't build it, and especially if, as is also mentioned in here, we terminate the London end at Old Oak Common, a random bit of West London, rather than a major terminus, no one will use it. It will completely kill... I mean, all the money we've spent on it has been wasted. It's an extraordinary decision to be even thinking about making.
Well, even some Tories, though, have said that it's probably best to pull the plug now because so much money has been wasted, and how much more do you plough into something?
It's fair, but the thing is that money's not going to be spent on anything better. Whenever you have this argument, there's always a list of people being like, oh, but you could build this half-dozen infrastructure projects, you know, you could electrify. And, yeah, that might be true, but let's face it, that's not going to happen. And if they did try and build those things would end up over budget and late as well, and then they'd cancel them on the same basis. At some point, we simply have to bite the bullet and get stuff built.
But Moya, this is going to be a very difficult one for Rishi Sunak because even his Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove, is wanting to push for the full line.
The full line.
Built.
Yeah, and don't forget, we've already cut the Leeds part of this line. It's already been scaled back in its ambitions. It's way delayed in when it should have been delivered in the first place. It will be a tough one, but the problem, as we've seen this week, is that Rishi Sunak does not seem to be making decisions based on the public good, no matter what he's saying. He's making decisions based upon his own political instincts, which I think personally are very bad. So even if this is a tough decision and he gets pushback from within his own party, he's shown with the net zero rollback that he is not afraid to do that if he is committed to that plan of action, even if the majority of, you know, the country or the people whose opinions we respect think it is erroneous.
Let's move on to the Telegraph, shall we? This story, it's not very large, but it's not the major headline, but it's a story telling us that the Home Office is forcing contractors to book hotels for at least a minimum of 3 stars. And this is to house small boat migrants after costs rose to £8 million a day.
I feel like we could almost just play a best-of clip of one of the last times I did this show when we had another story like this. The government has consistently failed, and again, this links back to HS2, it's failed to bite the bullet and build a dedicated asylum estate. If you're going to have a policy that requires you to have a lot of people in some form of detention, you need somewhere to put them. The government hasn't built it, and so as a result, they keep scrabbling around for hotels. And because there are minimum standards as to how you keep people, that means you get headlines like this, where the Home Secretary has had to say, minimum standards of 3 stars, close to local amenities and transport. And that's just maximising the pain for the government, not just because headlines like this are going to irritate anti-immigration voters, although it will, but because instead of having those people in one place, you spread the problem around. Every time a hotel is booked out by the Home Office, it causes local anger because often people have had events planned there that get cancelled. It's somewhere that might previously have been somewhere that employed local people, which will be taken over by contractor staff. So, yeah, it's a small story, but it's a small part of a big perennial problem, which is the government is firefighting its failure to build a proper asylum estate, which it should have done 10 years ago.
But what about processing those asylum claims? I mean, that That would solve the problem, wouldn't it?
Oh, it absolutely would. But then you'd have to invest in an awful lot more Home Office staff, and they don't want to spend money on doing that either. Or you simply start rubber stamping people. But if you're going to have the system they have now, where you try and process people the way they do, you need A, somewhere to put the people while you're processing them, and B, an awful lot more staff to process them more quickly. But they don't want to spend money on either of them. So here we are.
You also need the political will, because as Robert Jenrick revealed earlier in this year, that is part of the policy, even if it's not the stated policy of Rishi Sunak, it seems to be the stated policy of the Immigration Minister, that they're deliberately keeping the asylum processing claims list long because they think that it deters more people from coming here in small boats. It does not deter people from coming here in small boats, and the more that we prevent the establishment of, as we've said, an asylum estate, but also a safe legal routes, essentially, we're going to see more people displaced by the climate change that we're refusing to fight by rolling back our net zero commitments. And we're going to see more people getting here by any means possible, because people will still come. And what they'll be greeted with instead is being dispersed around the country in random hotels. The Home Office will continue to insist that we're going to send them to Rwanda at some point, which is never going to happen. It's a completely dehumanising plan. And we will just see more fragmentation and dehumanisation of these people.
I mean, you said, Henry, that the government are not going to want to do this, but Sir Keir Starmer has said that he would invest more in Home Office staff to process these claims.
Absolutely, and that would be a good idea. Now, the question remains as to whether or not he'll do it. Starmer is going to inherit an absolutely abysmal fiscal situation, and I expect that an awful lot of spending promises that Labour make before the election just will not survive contact with the first year of being in office. That's nothing really to do with them. That's just a state of how, Jeremy Hunt at the last budget rolled over £30 billion worth of spending cuts into the post-election fiscal year, which Labour are going to have to deal with. It's going to be absolutely horrifying. But yet, in principle, if Labour did it, that would be one way to solve this. You either need more staff or you need more detention, or both.
To the Daily Express, Moya, and the headline there, PM told only true Tory values can save a party's soul. These are the grandees within the party and others, telling the Prime Minister what he needs to do.
Emphasis on "and others," because if you actually get to the meat of this story, it turns out the others are not really grandees, but in fact a new intake of 2019, the so-called red wall Tory MPs, who tend to err on the side of extreme social conservatism. And the true Tory values that they're referring to is go even harder on the extreme right-wing policies that we've seen rolled out thus far. They're saying, the Liberal threat from the Liberal Democrats and, Labour is nothing in these blue wall seats. Don't worry about that. We need to hammer the message we're doing. We need to go harder on cutting back net zero. We need to go hard on immigration. We need to do all the things that we've already seen us drop about 20 points in the polls. Just keep on doing that. So the idea that as grandees saying this is actually quite misleading when you get into the depth of this article.
And Henry, do you think the Prime Minister is going to heed the advice, and are they right?
Well, I mean, he'll have to heed it to an extent, because there's quite a lot of these MPs and he's got a very fractious parliamentary party. This is one of the reasons I don't think the smoking ban will happen. But in terms of their analysis, no. They say here in this article that the idea of a Liberal challenge in southern seats is complete nonsense. It's not. If you look at the so-called blue wall, which is traditional Conservative seats, which are viewed to be under threat, they have their average age of voters in those seats is going down. This is a country with an ageing population, and yet those voters are moving out of London. London is radiating voters who have no reason to love the Conservatives into traditional home county seats. That is an existential risk for large parts of the party, and they ignore it at their peril.
OK, Henry and Moya, for the moment, thank you very much. Coming up, the King gives a speech on the existential threat of climate change, then flies home in a private jet. Is that a mixed message? We'll discuss that and more next. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Moya Lothian-McLean and Henry Hill. Let's take a look at the Times, this story, page 4 of the Times, about electric cars and the price of second-hand electric cars. They're suggesting that they've almost fallen 25% in the past year. Dealers are blaming this on consumer confidence, and we've had the delay to the 2050 net zero target. Well, not a delay to the target, but a delay to the ban on petrol and diesel cars, moved from 2030 to 2035. And this is affecting the market.
Yeah, Absolutely. So basically, in the story it says that this hasn't just happened overnight in response to Rishi Sunak's announcement, it should be said, but over the past year, prices have fallen quite substantially. There's debate about why this is in the piece. Some people are saying it's a general fall of consumer confidence. There's other people saying that actually there was an artificial spike in prices due to the shortage of components during the pandemic. So there are a variety of reasons. But it does mean that people who have bought electric cars, often at very high prices, do risk falling into negative equity on those cars when they try and sell them, and it's left a lot of dealers angry because they've bought these things up and then they've been stuck on forecourts for months, losing value. Now, of course, in the long run, we want the price of electric cars to come down, because if we do want mass adoption of these vehicles, they need to come down to roughly the point where petrol cars are now. So in the long run, this is good. But falling consumer confidence is a really interesting one, because one of the biggest issues with the diesel car ban, and indeed the general move towards electric cars, is that it's not just about the cars, it's about the infrastructure. Because by 2030, ideally, we would have, if the government had its way on its original target, we would be moving to a position where lots of people are driving electric cars. There is nothing resembling the petrol station infrastructure, right? Charge points are slow and they're scarce, and there are big queues for them. There aren't enough of them, especially outside London. And I think that if Rishi Sunak and indeed an incoming Labour government really want to boost consumer confidence in electric cars, they will need to go a lot further and a lot faster on building the infrastructure to make driving an electric car practical. And until they do, this market is not going to take off.
Moya, that has to be the key, doesn't it? The
Of course. If you read this piece, then there's actually a case study from a car dealer who says that he's this incredible sort of contradictory thing where he says, you know, the country isn't in the right place in terms of infrastructure or widespread switch to electric, as Henry's pointed out, there's a reason for that. So he says it's right to delay the ban. But the problem is that delaying the ban is not going to mean that infrastructure is sped up. It just means that we delay creating that infrastructure. The whole point of this delay was not that we would actually get our ducks in order, it's to put it off until the last minute. This is the problem. It's like HS2, we delay, and we don't go faster, build faster. And it's surely investing in this infrastructure would create a hell of a lot of jobs in the first place and create more industry for electric cars in the first place.
But also the delay in the ban means that people are thinking, well, I don't have to get an
I
electric
don't have to get this car. And I think it's worth noting as well, as I'm sure other people have this week, that the ban on petrol and diesel vehicles is not a ban on buying second-hand cars, it's just a ban on buying new cars. Yeah. And this has been pointed out across the media, but most people who are in lower income situations, we're not buying cars new, we're buying second-hand cars. It's not that you can't get hold of a petrol or diesel car after 2035 or 2030, it's that there's simply a ban on buying these brand new cars, on producing new cars and buying these new cars. So everything that Rishi Sunak has said in rationalising why he rolled back these net zero commitments doesn't make any sense for either the country or the consumer.
See, that's the one bit I'm not sure on, because ultimately, no, people hate building infrastructure. You can have voters telling pollsters that they support net zero. You try and build some power pylons in their back garden or in the fields behind their house, they're all against it.
The NIMBYs all
precisely.
come out. We've just got time to go to the Daily Star, which we don't often do. And the Daily Star don't often do serious stories, but this is one, despite the cartoon, the caricature there. This is actually a serious story about the King and the speech that he's given regarding the environment and then his mode of transport.
Yeah, they're basically calling him a hypocrite because he, after doing a big speech about the Entente Cordiale and how the biggest threat that's facing us is the existential challenge of climate change, he then hopped on a private jet, which I think produced 100 times more carbon per person in that one journey. So the Star are calling out Charles, and they've also got a little picture of Rishi Sunak behind him, who they said loves taking his government chopper on short journeys.
Henry, very quickly, your thoughts?
Solving climate change is about big structural stuff like the cars. I've no time for this kind of story. It's not micro hair shirt stuff that's going to... He needs to get around, and he's the king. Of course, he's going to have a private plane.
Take the Eurostar.
You're not going to put him in economy, are you?
I'll leave you quarrelling over that.